Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be looking back at the budget of October 2024 and a programme that I had with Andy Wood, tax barrister and founder of Mosaic Chambers in Dubai, when Andy was kind enough to look into his crystal ball and see what he predicted for the upcoming budget. Andy, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stephen.
Good to see you. I'm sure your weather is better than ours at the moment, and I'm extremely jealous, but there we are. We'll get on with the show. Andy, what I propose to do is go through the various subjects that we discussed at the time and your predictions of what may or may not happen then. Now, what we did talk about to start with was inheritance tax, and there was a lot of I don't know whether fear is too strong a word, but a lot of concern about inheritance tax being increased. And in the event, at the time you said no increases were anticipated. And unless I've got it totally wrong, I think the only real change was to the transfer of farms, was it not?
Well, there are two, I think, quite significant changes from an IHT perspective. The first one, you're absolutely right, Stephen, is, I guess, a two-pronged attack. The farmers use prongs, I don't know, but a two-pronged attack against business property relief and agricultural property relief. So at the moment, if you own, generally speaking, any private business assets and also usually any agricultural assets, and you farm them or you have somebody farming them on your behalf, to cut a long story short, there is potentially 100% relief from inheritance tax. And I guess that really is to allow, if you're passing on the business or the farm to the next generation, it enables you to do that without the government coming along and taking a big bite out of it. And as we're probably aware, that once you get over the nil rate band, then the inheritance tax rate is 40%. So it's a pretty big bite. And the new rules have pulled away that, I guess, that 100% relief beyond the value of $1 million. So if you're trying to pass on business assets in excess of $1 million or farming assets, qualifying farming assets that are valued at over $1 million, then that first $1 million you get the 100% relief, but the excess you only get 50%. So quite a significant change for business owners and farmers, and we have obviously seen quite a lot of noise from the farmers, I guess, whipped up by Jeremy Clarkson.
The government have said on this that there's two issues. One is that the thresholds it's fairly low or high, whichever way you look at it. So most of the smaller farms that it would affect across the country are outside of this increase. And secondly, even if they are within the scope of the new taxation, you're going to be given, is it 10 years to pay the money over, which I suppose is helpful. But what occurs to me was, I mean, here we are, we're a property orientated programme. Here we are broadcasting from Canary Wharf. £1 million will just about buy you a 2-bedroom flat, never mind about a farm. Now, I appreciate values are different across the country, and we have to be careful how we assess the value of a farm, whether it's the business or just the pure land value or the land value with planning permission. But it does seem a fairly low bar to haul people into this taxation change. And a little bit like the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance from pensioners, the income can't be that great in terms of potential, can it?
Yeah, again, I think in terms of the yield that is earned on, from introducing these inheritance tax changes, it seems to me to be a little bit tinkering around the edges in terms of what the government will raise from it. I think it'll raise a lot less than they think. But I think it's really the message, and I think the psychological impact that it has on the people who are running the businesses and running the farms. Whereas, in a scenario where you're aware that if you carry on with the business, you pass it on to the next generation, we can do that without any financial, bear traps. I think that's a much better position to be in. And I think they could have done something slightly different, where they say, well, actually, we will give you, we'll keep business property relief or agricultural property relief as it is. So when you pass it on to the next generation, you get the relief. But if the next generation don't bother running the business or don't bother operating a farm, so all really that's happened is there's been a shift in essentially tax-free wealth for the next generation, then perhaps they could look at withdrawing and clawing back that relief. So say, the business isn't being operated in 3 years' time or 5 years' time by the next generation, then it's been sold, then the relief is withdrawn. I think that would have been a much fairer way of doing it.
Does the threshold just relate to the land value, or is it land value plus the business value?
Yeah, so farms will usually have a little bit of both. So APR is available and applicable to the agricultural value, whereas any excess, then business property relief will potentially apply. But the 1 million cap, you don't get £1 million of business property relief and £1 million of APR. It's essentially just one threshold that applies to both.
Okay, all right. I'm just thinking how it would apply to a tenant farmer as opposed to a landowning farmer who just transfers on death or whatever the business side of things and perhaps the lease of the property. Does it affect them at all?
Yeah, so in that scenario, if they're passing the business then BPR would apply to the value of the business.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, let's move on. Your next prediction was that on pensions, you doubted whether there would be much change in either the value of pensions or, in fact, the way or amount of contributions people made to pensions. And how's that shaped up?
The sort of rumour around reducing tax relief on contributions is something that pops up every single year, and I think, like a stopped clock, it will eventually be right one day. But it wasn't in October. The other it's a good point you've brought us back to that second IHT change. Really, Stephen, was regarding again the fairly sort of puzzling decision to impose inheritance tax on most registered pension schemes. And I say most because actually I think the ones that it hasn't been imposed on probably were subject to IHT anyway. But at the moment, if you let's say you have a registered pension scheme and you have a surplus amount in there and you die, then there are two different tax treatments depending on whether you are 75 or not. If you die before 75 and you've still got some funds in your pension scheme, the fairly thin silver lining there is that you can pass on the wealth to your beneficiaries without any tax at all. If you've been very unlucky and you've just gone one day over your 75th birthday, then anything that is left in the pension scheme can be paid to the beneficiaries, but they would pay income tax at their prevailing rate. So if they're the beneficiaries are 45% taxpayer, they would pay 45% on that receipt. So there's a cliff edge at 75. So that is a bit strange, and you might have thought, well, something could be done to stop such a cliff edge being in place. But no, the government didn't decide to do that. Instead, they decided to just add some inheritance tax on both of those. So if you now die before 75, there's no income tax to the beneficiaries, but there's an IHT charge, potentially 40%. If you die post 75, then there is both an inheritance tax charge and an income tax charge on what the beneficiaries get. So you have this ludicrous scenario where potentially, if the pensioner dies post 75 with surplus in the pension scheme of a rate of up to 67% on the value which remains, but which is, again, just seems fairly preposterous, doesn't it? But there we are. I guess if you stand back a few thousand yards, you might well look at this. So, well, actually, pensions, they're not designed as vehicles to pass on value to the next generation. So maybe we shouldn't be encouraging that type of behavior. But the issue is, really, you make the change now, and the changes would be effective from April 2027. I mean, it is subject to consultation, but I think that's the planned.
But Andy, listen, if you talk about double taxation, you've also got to talk about double relief. And I'm sorry, I'm very naive when it comes to these taxation matters, but it seems to me that if you're getting tax relief on the money that you're putting into a pension, then after that pension period has expired, in other words, you've expired too, it's not unreasonable for government to claw some of that relief back by a taxation of passing it on, because otherwise you'd have a double relief situation rather than a double taxation.
Yeah, I think that is the point that you may make. That I was saying, if you stand back a few thousand yards, you could look at it. But I think for me, the issue is that you are moving the goalposts. I think for people who have maybe spent many decades planning their retirement on a particular basis, and now there's been a real sort of rug pull, and unless something dramatic happens in the consultation, this is what it will look like. And I think it's one of there are a couple of real flaws in the UK tax system. One is the complexity. The second is things like this, that everything changes too much. It's far too fluid, and those two things combined just make planning as an individual or a business or a foreign investor completely impossible.
Well, I think you hit on a good point there, and a good expression is the moving of goalposts, which of course the ladies suffered from terribly over the pension age, didn't they? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
They argued they weren't informed properly. They were informed that they had a set period of working through their lives, and there was a set pension date, and it changed without really the proper notice or the information being provided properly. But anyway, did you anticipate any change in perhaps the government's attitude to the triple lock in terms of pensions? Did you think they were going to perhaps fiddle with that?
In my view, I think the triple lock, it's not really my area of expertise, but it seems to be breaking the triple lock, even if it may well actually to get a little bit of flexibility back into the levers that the government can pull to try and sort of help us slither out of the situation we're in. The triple lock seems to be, as the name suggests, but from a slightly different angle, just seems to be a bit of a lock and a block on what the Chancellor and the Treasury can do. But again, it just seems to be one of those sort of sacred cows, really, doesn't it? It's almost inconceivable that any politician would come out and say, you know what, we need to have a sensible discussion around the triple lock.
Well, they did with the fuel allowance, didn't they?
Well, they did, and yeah, I mean, I must admit, in terms of the things that they could have picked upon to make them immediately incredibly unpopular with a lot of their core voters, that probably would have been one of them, wouldn't it?
And potentially for very, very little saving, really.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
in the scale of things. Okay, well, let's move on to now something that really is sort of property related, and that was the potential of taxes being brought in on either stamp duty or second home taxes, or increasing in local authority taxes for second homes or inappropriate homes. You saw it then as perhaps an increase in taxes for foreign investors going up, which actually proved to be absolutely right, and the change on holiday let treatment, which I think has some sort of tax benefits, which I'm going to ask you to just broadly explain in a moment. But I think in principle, you got the two targets there, didn't you? My feeling is about stamp duty. I've held for a long time that I think it should be paid by the seller, not the purchaser. I think it would help young people get on the housing ladder, because it would then turn into a tax that you could fund with your mortgage or whatever loan you've got. A lot of people say, oh, well, that's not fair because we paid stamp duty going in. Well, that's okay. You pay stamp duty going out, less whatever you've paid coming in, if that be the case, if it's a retrospective situation. I'm a little bit against an increase in stamp duty for overseas owners. I think back to the recession of 2010 going through to probably about 2014, where it was foreign investors, particularly in the London market, that kept us afloat, really, in the property market. So I don't know what your view is on that increase, which is now effectively a 3% supplement, isn't it, if you're a foreign investor?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, the change is slightly more. I think in Labour's manifesto, I think they had suggested a 1% addition to the surcharge for non-residents. I think at the moment it's 2%, and they were suggesting putting that up by 1%. But I think in reality they didn't directly do that, did they, in the budget? And they did something I think much more clever, actually. They increased the SDLT rate for additional properties. So if you buy a second or third or fourth property, the SDLT rate, you're up until the budget, you added another 3% broadly onto the rate, and that's now gone up by another 2% to 5%. And the reason why I say that's clever is because automatically, actually, I think if you've got an overseas investor, it will more than likely be an additional property for them. So not only have they managed to wring a few extra quid out of non-resident investors, and let's face it, that's the perfect type of tax policy, isn't it? Because it's somebody who is wealthy, but also somebody who may well not actually get to vote in an election. So it's the perfect crime, really, and the public at large are happy because it's a tax that they might not be paying, which is again another tick in the box for a tax. People are happy with taxes that other people pay. Anyway, so I digress. So that was the change to SDLT, that if you are buying a second property now, rather than just adding the 3% on, it is a 5% surcharge. I think the other element that you mentioned around furnished holiday lets has been trailed for quite some time. So I think that was announced well before the budget, and I suspect probably by Jeremy Hunt at the prior Tory budget, but certain, I guess, commercial lettings, so furnished holiday lettings, where you might have a cottage in the Lake District that you let for a week at a time, or a fortnight, or even more recently things like Airbnbs in the city for city breaks, it was possible, if you met various qualifying criteria, for it to be classed as a furnished holiday let, which meant that a lot of the reliefs that are available for trading companies are not usually available for property investment businesses. An FHL business could get them. So things like, I guess, business asset disposal relief, things like capital allowances. If you provided a lot of additional services, potentially business property relief as well, although that is an awful lot of case law around when a property, a furnished holiday lettings business might be, it might qualify for business property relief or not. So it became, I guess, a quasi trade if you qualified for furnished holiday lettings. But that is no more. The FHL regime has been removed.
But Andy, on a lot of these property-related matters, it often occurs to me that in the way, for instance, the government is encouraging people to invest via a company, or the investment for buy-to-let be with the bigger companies, the institutions, they say it's because they want to improve letting standards. I'm not quite so sure about that, because if you look at the amount of complaints with local authority housing compared with the private sector, the local authority comes out way on top when it comes to substandard provision. But I do wonder sometimes whether these government things are not so much geared to getting income into the government, but actually just the ease of tax collection. I mean, if you've got hundreds of thousands of small private landlords renting properties out, it's very difficult to assess what their income is if they don't declare it properly. Again, we've got little things in where overseas people own properties. The agent will be required to pay an amount of tax on account directly from the rent. Well, that's fine. But that, of course, is if you're using a registered agent to take that tax. So I just wonder whether some of these things are more inclined to be about collecting taxes rather than actually collecting income. I mean, I know it's probably the same result at the end of the day, but it's the motivation that I question sometimes.
Tax collection it's about sometimes I think shooting fish in barrels, really. And if the barrel is really big and the fish are really small, it's more difficult to hit them, really. But if you are, your example of landlords, if you have, you know, a small number of big landlords who are all very much accountable to you, you know, you've got bigger fish in a smaller barrel, really. So shooting them is much easier rather than shooting the landlords. You might want to collect the taxes from them. So I think there's a lot in that about sanitizing whether the landlords in your example, but I can very much see a day in the future when digitally everything is pretty much online, and it's relatively easy to collect real-time information, where pretty much any payment is going through some kind of digital gateway, and almost tax is being accounted for in real time. So much like your salary is, you have tax deducted at source. I can see a scenario where the same applies for private companies, and the same applies for contractors and things like that. That payments are having tax deducted and withheld at source, a bit like you mentioned with the non-resident landlords. That tenants and agents are sometimes obliged to withhold tax from their payments. So, I can see a similar scenario much more widely in the UK tax system as it becomes digital.
It could almost sort of work the other way around, couldn't it? You could have a system enforced where in fact, if you're paying rent, that payment out to a landlord must be made via a bank, and as some other payments through money laundering, for instance. And that payment must also be associated with a registration number of the landlord.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite easy to implement rather than these sort of rather backdoor methods, which I mean we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I think if
Absolutely.
I think if the government was a little bit more straightforward, tax collection might be a bit easier. And I just do worry that if we have these systems that seem to penalise the smaller landlord, who have been terribly effective in providing rental properties to the whole country over these last 20 or 30 years, they will gradually disappear. The responsibility then for offering rental properties will fall with either bigger companies or local authorities. And that number will be reduced significantly because
Yeah.
there are only so many people who want to get involved in that kind of business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth remembering as well that I think as a nation of taxpayers, we're a pretty compliant bunch. There were some figures released the other day. It might have been the Public Accounts Committee. I'm not sure, but certainly some official figures suggesting that without any prompting, people were 95% of people were compliant with their taxes in the UK. Now, question is how do they know of all the taxes that aren't being paid? But certainly in terms of the projections, it suggests that we're very sort of complicit, also very compliant body of taxpayers. So there's kind of this thought that everybody, if you're a sole trader or you're a landlord, that everybody's dodging their taxes and looking for ways around it, but the data doesn't really support that.
There was talk of a UK exit tax for those people that wanted to run away from their responsibilities in this country and perhaps go into a country with a lesser stringent tax regime. Has that exodus come to fruition?
Well, I think there's certainly reports suggesting that there is a flow of people out of the UK and elsewhere. I think there was a suggestion in the last sort of calendar year, I think it was 10 to 11,000 millionaires had left the UK. I think if you zoom out a little bit on the data, I think that's a trend which has been happening since the pandemic. To be fair, and I think, as you said, Steve and I live out here in the UAE at the moment, and it's amazing actually how many of the British people and other foreigners actually you meet who actually they came here at the beginning of COVID. So I think it's a steady trend, which the changing government certainly hasn't helped with.
I'm just going to remind you of what your comments were at the time, that it perhaps ought to be called a small jet's exit rather than a small boat's exit.
Yeah. I was quite pleased with that little analogy.
So there we are. Okay. Well, look, Andy Wood, tax barrister, thank you so much for coming on the programme today. Really informative information.
No, it was a pleasure, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Good. Look forward to seeing you next time, Andy. That's all we've got time for today. So from me, Stephen Galpin, thank you for watching Property Matters. See you again next time.